I never thought my life would spiral into such a nightmare. If anyone had told me, just a few years ago, that I would be sitting here recounting the way my boss tried to strangle every ounce of dignity out of me for money, I would have laughed it off. I always imagined corruption as something distant, the kind of thing you saw on the news about foreign governments or crooked billionaires, not something that would crawl into the fluorescent-lit office where I spent most of my waking hours. But reality has a way of making fools of us. When I first walked through the glass doors of Halston Moore Consulting, I believed I had finally made it. After years of grinding through underpaid internships, temporary contracts, and freelance gigs that barely kept the lights on, this was the kind of opportunity one had dreamed about. A permanent position, a salary that was more than just survival, health insurance, the possibility of finally moving out of my cramped studio apartment into a place that felt like home. The office itself seemed like a promise of a better future. Polished marble floors in the lobby, walls lined with minimalist artwork that screamed success without needing to say a word. The air smelled faintly of expensive coffee beans from the cafe on the ground floor. I remember standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom on my first day, straightening my tie, whispering to myself, "You're finally here. You belong." For the first few weeks, that illusion held strong. My co-workers were professional, if a little guarded. My boss, Mr. Carter, came across as charismatic, the kind of man who could fill a room with his presence. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of smile that made you believe every word he said. He shook my hand firmly on that first day and told me, "We're a family here, you work hard, and we take care of you." I wanted to believe him. I buried myself in projects, eager to prove that I was worth the investment. I stayed late, answered emails on weekends, and volunteered for the difficult assignments that others seemed to avoid. Slowly, I felt myself becoming part of the rhythm of the place. My paychecks came on time. I upgraded my apartment. I treated myself to dinners I could never have afforded before. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't constantly calculating whether I could stretch a bag of rice another week. But looking back, I realized that the cracks were there from the beginning. I just didn't want to see them. The first odd moment came when Carter asked me to step into his office after a team meeting. The blinds were drawn, the lights dim. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers like some cliché villain out of a movie. "You're doing good work," he said. "Exceptional, even. And I reward loyalty. But loyalty isn't just about meeting deadlines. It's about understanding how things work here." I nodded, unsure what he meant, waiting for him to elaborate. But instead, he simply smiled, dismissed me with a wave of his hand, and said, "We'll talk soon." At the time, I chalked it up to his eccentric style. Some bosses like to keep their employees guessing. Maybe it was just his way of motivating me. Weeks passed. My workload grew heavier, but so did my confidence. I was delivering results. Clients praised my reports. My name started coming up more often in management discussions. I told myself that Carter's cryptic comments were nothing to worry about. Until the day he called me into his office again. This time, he closed the door. He didn't waste time with small talk. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and said, "You want to keep climbing here, don't you?" "Of course," I replied. "Good, because this is a competitive company. A lot of people want what you have. You understand that?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Then you also understand that sometimes, to stay ahead, you have to contribute." The word hung in the air. Contribute. I didn't know what he meant, but my stomach twisted. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the desk. Inside was a list of names, people I recognized. My colleagues. Some were smiling faces I saw every day in the break room. Next to each name was a number. A large number. "These are people who understand what it means to be part of this company," Carter said. "They know how to show their commitment." I stared at the list. My pulse pounded in my ears. Was he implying money? Carter smiled at my silence. "Think of it as insurance. You pay a small amount, regularly. In return, you never have to worry about your position. I look out for you. Promotions, raises, security, it's all part of the package." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt surreal, like I had suddenly slipped into a different reality. "But, isn't that illegal?" I stammered. Carter chuckled, shaking his head as though I were a naive child. "Illegal? don't be dramatic. We're talking about appreciation, support. You support me, I support you. That's how real business works. If you're not interested, well, there are plenty of hungry people out there who'd love your desk. And just like that, the conversation was over. He leaned back, smiled, and told me to think about it. I walked out of his office in a daze. My legs felt heavy, my mind spinning. The marble floors that once gleamed with promise now felt cold and hostile. I passed my coworkers in the hallway, wondering how many of them had their names in that folder, how many of them had already paid. Their smiles suddenly looked like masks, hiding something darker. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Contribute, insurance, support. The words twisted into something monstrous. I thought about my rent, my bills, the fragile stability I had only just begun to build. If I lost this job, it would all collapse. The next day, Carter didn't mention our conversation. He treated me as though nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the weight pressing down on my chest. Every time I caught his eyes across the conference table, I felt like he could see straight through me, measuring me, waiting for my answer. For a week, I tried to ignore it. I buried myself in work, convincing myself that maybe he'd forget, maybe he had just been testing me. But then, late on a Friday evening, as the office emptied out and I gathered my things, Carter appeared at my desk. He smiled that same perfect smile and said, "Have you thought about our conversation?" I swallowed hard. I'm not sure. His smile faded, just a little, his eyes hardened. Don't take too long, opportunities have a way of disappearing. He walked away, leaving me frozen in my chair. That weekend, I felt like I was suffocating. Every decision seemed impossible. If I refused, I might lose everything I'd worked for. If I agreed, I'd be selling not just my money, but my dignity, my soul. And then, Monday morning, an envelope appeared on my desk. No name, no note, just an amount scrawled on the front, a number that made my stomach drop. The envelope sat on my desk like a silent threat. It was thin, unmarked, and yet it carried the weight of 1,000 bricks. My name wasn't written anywhere on it, but I knew, deep in the pit of my stomach, that it was meant for me. I picked it up with trembling hands and slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one number scrawled in thick black ink. The amount was more than half of my monthly rent. Not enough to destroy me outright, but enough to make a point. This wasn't optional. I looked around the office, but the floor was quiet. Most people hadn't arrived yet. The morning sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, illuminating everything except the storm inside my chest. I wanted to believe it was some kind of sick joke, but Carter's voice echoed in my head, "Think of it as insurance." I stuffed the envelope back into my drawer and shut it quickly, as if that could make it disappear. But it stayed there, burning in my mind all day. Every time my phone buzzed, every time Carter passed by with his effortless smile, I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my bank app. The numbers glared back at me, cold and insufficient. I had just enough savings to scrape together the first payment, but doing so would mean sacrificing the tiny safety net I'd fought so hard to build. It felt like feeding myself to a wolf, knowing it would only come back hungrier. And yet, the fear of losing everything else, the job, the apartment, the fragile sense of stability, was stronger. The next morning, before I could think too hard, I withdrew the money in cash. My fingers shook as I placed it in a plain envelope. Walking into the office felt like marching toward an execution. Carter wasn't in yet, so I left the envelope on his desk and fled before anyone could see. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My stomach churned, my throat dry. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't even bring myself to look at my coworkers. Every laugh, every casual conversation around me sounded hollow, as though everyone knew the secret I was carrying. That evening, as I packed my things, Carter appeared. He said nothing at first, just gave me that smile, the one that had once seemed reassuring but now looked like the grin of a predator. He placed a hand on my shoulder, leaned close, and whispered, "Good, you've made the right choice. I knew you were loyal." His words made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to nod. Walking home, I felt sick. I told myself it would just be this once, that maybe now he'd leave me alone, but deep down, I knew better. The cycle begins. A week later, another envelope appeared. This time the number was larger. Not outrageous, but enough to hurt. Enough to remind me who was in control. And so the cycle began. Every month, sometimes twice a month, another envelope would arrive. Each time, the number grew just a little higher, like a predator testing how much its prey could endure. And each time, I paid. At first, I convinced myself it was temporary. Maybe if I showed loyalty for a few months, Carter would move on, find another victim, ease his grip. But instead, the more I gave, the deeper his claws sank. My bank account drained faster than I could refill it. I stopped eating out, cancelled my streaming subscriptions, sold my gaming console. My life shrank to bare survival, rent, utilities, food, and the payments. I started avoiding friends. How could I explain why I was always broke? Why I flinched every time my phone buzzed with a new notification? Loneliness crept into my bones, isolating me further. My world became a triangle: work, home, bank, and Carter. Always Carter, looming like a shadow over every decision I made. The breaking point. One night, after making yet another payment, I sat in my darkened apartment staring at the empty wine bottle on the table. My hands shook as I held my head, trying not to cry. I had spent years clawing my way out of poverty, building something from nothing, and now it was all crumbling because one man decided my dignity had a price. The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the silence, the fact that I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Carter was respected, admired, seen as a mentor by many in the office. If I spoke out, I'd be branded a liar, a troublemaker, maybe even fired. And then what? I thought about quitting, walking away, starting fresh somewhere else, but fear pinned me down. My resume wasn't strong enough to guarantee another job quickly, and unemployment would mean disaster. I told myself I just had to hold on, that something would change. But nothing changed. The envelopes kept coming. Until one day, the number doubled. I stared at it in disbelief. This wasn't a test anymore, it was a chokehold. He wanted to see how far I could bend before I broke. That night, I snapped. I stormed into Carter's office the next morning, my heart pounding, hands shaking. For the first time, I didn't care about consequences. "This has to stop," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't keep doing this. You're bleeding me dry." Carter didn't even flinch. He leaned back, folded his hands, and studied me like a scientist observing a specimen. Then he smiled. "You think you can just walk away?" he said calmly. "Do you know how many files I have? Do you know how easy it would be to make you look like the criminal here? Fraud, embezzlement, harassment, you name it. People believe what I tell them. Not you." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. He leaned closer, his voice low and sharp. "Pay the amount, or you'll lose more than just your job." I left his office shaking, my vision blurred with rage and terror. He had me trapped completely. Descent. From that point on, everything spiraled. I maxed out my credit cards, took out small loans, telling myself it was temporary. Each payment became a wound, cutting deeper, leaving scars I couldn't hide. Sleep deserted me, food lost its taste. My reflection in the mirror became a stranger, hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, the haunted look of someone slowly being devoured alive. Work, once a source of pride, turned into a daily torture chamber. I dreaded the sight of Carter. Every meeting felt like a performance, every report like a lifeline I clung to desperately. But the worst part was the silence, pretending everything was fine while inside I was collapsing, smiling in meetings, laughing at jokes, while every fiber of my being screamed that I was drowning. And Carter, he thrived. He grew bolder, colder, feeding off my fear. His smile became a blade, his words a chain. I was no longer an employee, I was his hostage. The moment of truth. One night, after pawning my last valuable possession to scrape together another payment, I walked home in the rain. The city lights blurred through my tears, my shoes squelched with every step. I felt hollow, like a ghost drifting through a world that no longer belonged to me. That's when the thought hit me. What if I stopped? What if I let it all collapse? The idea terrified me, but it also freed me. For the first time in months, I considered the possibility of reclaiming my life, even if it meant losing everything else. I didn't have a plan yet, didn't know how I would fight back, but as I collapsed into bed that night, soaked and exhausted, I whispered to myself, this isn't the end. Not yet. And for the first time, a tiny spark of defiance flickered inside me. The spark inside me was fragile, like a match struck in a storm, but it was there. For months I had been nothing more than a prisoner, bound by Carter's threats and my own fear. But that night, drenched from the rain, shivering in my dark apartment, I realized something I had been too terrified to admit before: he thrived because I allowed him to. Of course, that didn't mean breaking free would be simple. Carter held power, influence, and the ability to twist narratives. If I walked into HR and accused him, he could bury me under paperwork, falsified records, and carefully constructed lies. I had seen how people worshipped him, how his laughter lit up a room, how his confidence made others lean in like moths to a flame. But fire could burn, too. The first step was gathering proof. Silent watcher. I started small, cautious. At work, I installed a cheap recording app on my phone, set to activate whenever I pressed a side button. My hands shook the first time I slipped it into my pocket before stepping into Carter's office. But outwardly, I acted the same, submissive, nervous, obedient. He accepted the envelope I offered that day with his usual smugness. Good, he said, slipping it into his drawer. See, you know your place. Every syllable seared into my chest, but this time, instead of shame, I felt something sharper: determination. That night, I listened to the recording over and over. His voice, clear and unrepentant. My proof. It wasn't much, not enough to win a legal case yet, but it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, I collected more. Every meeting, every whispered demand, every smug reminder of my loyalty. My phone became both my lifeline and my weapon. But the secrecy ate at me. Carrying it alone was unbearable. I needed someone I could trust. An unexpected ally. Her name was Elena. She worked 2 cubicles down from me, quiet, efficient, always keeping her head down. For months, I had barely noticed her beyond polite greetings, but one evening, as we both worked late, she glanced at me with something different in her eyes, not curiosity, but recognition. You okay? She asked softly. The words nearly broke me. I wanted to spill everything right there. Instead, I forced a brittle smile, just tired. But she didn't buy it. The next day, she lingered near my desk and said, I know Carter isn't what he pretends to be. My heart stopped. I turned to her, stunned. What do you mean? Her voice dropped. Let's just say, you're not the only one he's cornered. The world tilted beneath me. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Over coffee that evening, Elena told me her story. Different circumstances, same pattern: Carter demanding loyalty, cornering her with threats of ruined reputation. She hadn't paid him, though. She'd refused. He retaliated by tanking one of her projects, nearly costing her her position. She had been keeping her head down ever since, waiting for a chance to fight back. When I told her about the recordings, her eyes lit up. That's it. That's what we need. If we can build a case together, he won't be able to bury us both. For the first time in months, hope felt real. The plan. We became co-conspirators. Every lunch break, every quiet corner became our war room. We strategized carefully, step by step. More recordings, not just of payments, but of his threats, his manipulations. Paper trails. Elena combed through old emails, saving every subtle but incriminating message he had sent. Witnesses. Carefully, quietly, we approached others who might have experienced the same. Most were too scared, but a few hinted that they knew Carter wasn't as clean as he appeared. Every piece of evidence was a brick, and together we were building a wall, something strong enough to withstand the storm he would unleash. But the closer we got, the more dangerous it became. Carter wasn't stupid. He sensed shifts, like a predator sniffing change in the wind. His smiles grew sharper, his questions more probing. One evening he cornered me alone in the elevator. You've been quiet lately, he said, his voice a knife cloaked in silk. Not losing your sense of loyalty, are you? I forced a shaky laugh. No, of course not. But inside, fear coiled tight. One slip, and everything would collapse. Cracks in the mask. Then came the day that changed everything. Elena and I had been working late again, double-checking recordings. Suddenly, Carter stormed into the office, furious about a missed report. His mask slipped for the first time in front of others. He shouted, slammed his fist on a desk, threatened to fire me on the spot. Unbeknownst to him, my phone was recording the entire meltdown. Later, when Elena and I played it back, we exchanged a look. This was gold, not just veiled threats, but open abuse, proof of his true nature. But the victory was short-lived. The next morning, Carter called me into his office. His smile was back, but his eyes were colder than ever. "You know, loyalty can be broken in many ways," he said quietly. "If I ever found out you were keeping things from me, I'd make sure you never worked in this city again. Do you understand?" The threat was clear. He knew something was off. The breaking wave. The next weeks were chaos. Balancing the facade of obedience while secretly preparing for war drained me to the core. Every day felt like walking a tightrope above fire. But the evidence grew. The recordings piled up. The emails painted a picture. We were close. Finally, Elena said, "It's time." We compiled everything into a single dossier. Dozens of recordings, copies of emails, witness testimonies, enough to crush Carter's carefully curated image. The night before we submitted it to HR, I couldn't sleep. My heart pounded with fear and anticipation. This was it, either salvation or destruction. The next morning, Elena and I walked into HR together, handed over the folder, and told our story. The fallout. The storm hit fast. HR called emergency meetings. Legal was involved. Whispers spread like wildfire through the office. Carter was summoned, his charm useless against the mountain of evidence. He raged, of course, denied everything, tried to twist it, to paint us as disgruntled employees seeking revenge, but the recording spoke louder than his words. When HR played his voice demanding payments, the room fell silent. His smile cracked. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Days turned into weeks as investigations unfolded. Eventually, Carter was suspended, then terminated. The company couldn't sweep it under the rug. There was too much proof, too many eyes watching now. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt empty. The victory was real, but the scars remained. My savings were gone, my nerves shredded, my trust in people fractured. And yet, there was freedom. Aftermath. Elena and I sat together one evening, watching the sunset from a cafe balcony. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence was peaceful, not heavy. Finally, she said, "You saved yourself." I shook my head. "We saved each other." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you lit the spark." I thought about that. The nights of despair, the envelopes, the fear that had nearly destroyed me, and then I thought about the recordings, the plan, the moment we stood together and said enough. For the first time in months, I felt something close to pride. The scars would remain, but they were proof of survival. And survival, I realized, was its own kind of victory. The office no longer smelled of fear. When Carter was gone, it was as though a storm had finally broken, leaving behind shattered branches and waterlogged streets. People walked differently. Their laughter returned, tentative but real, drifting through the hallways like sunlight after weeks of rain. And yet, even in his absence, I couldn't shake the shadows. My chest still tightened when I opened my email in the mornings, half expecting another venomous message. My ears still rang with echoes of his threats. Trauma doesn't vanish with the villain, it lingers, weaving itself into your bones. Picking up the pieces. The company offered apologies. Of course, HR sent carefully worded emails, full of phrases like, "deeply regret" and "committed to ensuring this never happens again." They praised Elena and me for our bravery. They promised counseling services, policy overhauls, training sessions. But apologies don't refill a bank account drained by extortion. They don't erase 5 months of fear, or the way my hands shook whenever I walked into Carter's office. I tried to focus on work again, but the passion was gone. My desk felt tainted, every corner haunted by memories. Even success tasted bitter. I no longer believed in the company, in its polished smiles and inspirational posters. So, a month after Carter's termination, I resigned. The search for freedom. Job hunting should have been exciting, a new start, a chance to reinvent myself. Instead, it felt like trudging through mud. Every interview carried its own weight. Why did you leave your previous company? I stumbled every time. How could I explain? If I told the truth, would they see me as courageous or as a liability? Would they believe me? Or would whispers of Carter's charisma still linger in the industry? So I gave vague answers about seeking growth and new challenges. But inside, I carried the story like a secret brand. Weeks passed, then months. Savings dwindled. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had fought Carter to escape financial strangulation. Yet now the weight of bills threatened to suffocate me anyway. The breaking point. One night, staring at overdue rent notices, I nearly lost hope. I felt the old darkness rising again, the same crushing despair that had once made me hand over those first envelopes. Was this victory? Was this what freedom looked like? But then I remembered Elena's words, "You lit the spark." And I realized something important. I couldn't let Carter win. Not in absence. Not in memory. He had taken too much already. Building something new. The idea started small, a whisper in the back of my mind. What if I worked for myself? I had skills, organization, project management, communication. Why not use them for something of my own instead of bending to another Carter? It was terrifying, stepping into the unknown, but fear had already been my constant companion. This time, it would not control me. I took freelance contracts, messy and unstable at first. Some weeks I earned barely enough to cover groceries. Other weeks I worked until dawn, chasing deadlines. But slowly, patterns formed, clients returned, referrals grew. For the first time, my success wasn't tied to someone else's approval. The ghosts that remain. Still, the past clung to me. Sometimes, walking into a meeting with a new client, I caught myself flinching at a sharp tone, waiting for the hidden threat. Sometimes I dreamed of Carter's smile, waking with my heart pounding. But healing is not the erasure of scars, it's learning to live with them. And there were moments of light, too, like the first time I paid rent entirely from my freelance earnings, or when Elena called, laughing, to tell me she had gotten a new job at a company that valued her. We weren't broken anymore, we were rebuilding. A letter I never sent. Months later, when the dust had truly settled, I wrote a letter to Carter. I never intended to mail it, it was more for me than for him. I wrote about the fear, the sleepless nights, the way he had tried to own me. I wrote about the envelopes, the threats, the despair, and then I wrote about the recordings, the evidence, the fall. Finally, I wrote this. You thought you had me, you thought my silence was your power, but silence can break, and when it does, it roars louder than you ever imagined. You didn't destroy me, you forged me. When I finished, I burned the letter. Watching the flames consume the words was strangely liberating. The dawn. A year after Carter's downfall, I stood in my own small office, nothing fancy, just a rented space with second-hand furniture and peeling paint, but it was mine. Clients called, deadlines loomed, stress piled up, but it was a stress I chose, not one forced upon me by fear. Freedom is messy, imperfect, exhausting, but it is freedom. And sometimes, when the sun sets and the office grows quiet, I remember the darkest nights. I remember the trembling hands, the whispered threats, the envelopes sliding across Carter's desk. Then I look around at what I've built, and I know this, he didn't win. I did. Final reflection. If you had told me years ago that I would one day defy a man like Carter, I would have laughed bitterly. I wasn't a fighter. I was quiet, compliant, desperate to keep my head down. But desperation can ignite courage. Fear can become fuel. My story isn't one of perfection, it's one of survival, of choosing to fight when surrender seemed easier, of lighting a spark in the darkest night and watching it grow into a fire. And though the scars remain, they remind me not of what I lost, but of what I overcame. I am free. And that, in the end, is everything.